All right, joining me now here on the Matthew Filipowicz Show is Eugene Jarecki. Eugene is a filmmaker whose works include The Trials of Henry Kissinger and Why We Fight. His latest film is The House I Live In. It examines the horrific costs of the war on drugs here in the United States. You can find it at thehouseilivin.org. Eugene, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so Eugene, I just saw the film this last weekend here in Boston, but let's begin our discussion with the evolution of the modern war on drugs. In the film, you show Richard Nixon initially saying some somewhat rational things about drug addiction, and then everything changes. What exactly happened?
Well, one of the remarkable things about Nixon, of course, he's always a little hard to read. He's got a real poker face. And at the time of the Nixon years, Nixon came to power by making crime a national issue for the first time in '68. And by doing so, he found that it resonated tremendously as an electoral issue. In many ways, you could say his tough-on-crime position at that time was instrumental to his victory. The funny thing is, however, that, and in 1971, he sort of carries that further and he declares an all-out war on drugs. And that war on drugs term comes from Nixon, and the war we've been dealing with ever since comes from Nixon. The strange thing is that privately, in his policymaking, as distinct from his electoral rhetoric, his policymaking, he didn't conduct it like a war. He spent 2/3 of his drug budget on drug treatment rather than law enforcement and getting tough. And yet, so that's what he did in private, and he knew that it worked. He knew that methadone clinics and other forms of compassion-based approaches to this were effective, and that the interdiction in law enforcement was not being effective. And yet, he also knew that it wouldn't sell well on the campaign trail. So out he went again in '72, talking like a tough-on-crime warrior.
And then, so Nixon happened, but then the real it really gets ratcheted up, as you say in the movie, during the Reagan years.
Yes, Nixon sort of handed the baton to a succession of presidents, and no one more than Ronald Reagan and Bill Clinton. This is a bipartisan matter, this war on drugs.
Yeah.
Politicians of both stripes try to prove to the public that they should get elected and stay elected by making you fear your neighbor and saying that they will be tough as nails on your neighbor. And Reagan did that. He ratcheted the drug war up from where Nixon had laid it. And then Bill Clinton came along and ratcheted it up again with three strikes programs and others. He made it far more tough even than Reagan had. And that's what we've seen is this sort of legacy of tough on crime, is that it's a little bit like doping. Once one of the bikers dopes, the other guys can't really get along or get ahead without thinking they have to compete with that. And so Nixon set the bar in a certain way in terms of talking tough and sounding a certain way, and that's been the mold for politicians ever since, even as it became more and more senseless, even as the war became a more and more grave failure.
Before we get to the real heart of the movie, which is the costs of the war, just let me ask, how is Obama when it comes to the war on? Obviously he hasn't done anything great. Where does he stand in the terms of the lineage?
Well, it's very similar in many ways to the way Obama is a bit confounding in a lot of areas. You can definitely say that his heart, from the time he was a candidate and before that, has been with the idea of sensible reform of the drug war. And so when I went to meet with his drug control director, who used to be called the drug czar, Gil Kerlikowske, early on in the administration, I had a real holiday in my heart because Kerlikowske told me, look, I'm not a drug czar. We don't believe in that kind of terminology, and we don't call this a drug war. We don't think you should have a war on your own people. It's no way to conduct a national policy like this that, of course, needs to have a tremendous treatment and compassion component to work. As any of us who know an addict knows, you have to have tough love. You can't just have tough. And so I was very pleased by that. But the problem has been, and I don't know whether to blame the Obama team or whether to just blame Washington, which I think is increasingly what one wants to blame in most things in this country, is that whatever the intentions were, whether they wanted to be friendlier toward it and warmer and fuzzier and better and more sensible, they've carried on relatively strongly business as usual. There are certain ways in which the healthcare bill and other aspects of Obama's work do sort of pose slightly better conditions for the reform of the drug war, but it's been minor at best, particularly, of course, in the eyes of those who are seeking to seriously reform this. They have not gotten what they wanted in any way from the Obama team. They've gotten a somewhat mixed message, muddled perhaps by these very disfiguring forces in Washington.
Well, let's get to the very heart of the movie. And again, I'm talking to Eugene Jarecki, the filmmaker of The House I Live In, and that is the actual costs of the drug war. So let's talk about the costs in terms of obviously there's financial costs, but even more so the cost of human costs, the cost of lives. Tell us about what you found in the film.
Well, the drug war has now been with us for 40 years, and it's a record of abject failure. We've spent $1 trillion on it. We've had 45 million drug arrests, 45 million. That has produced a condition where we now have 2.3 million people behind bars, more than any other country on earth. And what do we have to show for it? Drugs are cheaper, more available, and more in use by younger and younger people than ever before. So there is no level on which this has succeeded, and on every level on which it's been an abject disaster. The human cost of that I began to see when I traveled around the country in very personal ways, visiting with people at all levels of the drug war who have been touched by it, from drug dealers and drug users to family members to members of the community, and then ultimately also into law enforcement, cops, judges, jailers, wardens, everybody up and down the chain of command in this thing, the sort of family tree of the drug war. And I wanted to see how people's lives were affected. And what I found was victimhood. I found that people have been victimized by this war in all directions, not just the obvious victims, i.e. a poor young person who got involved with drugs at a very young, unguided age, and then found themselves on a slippery slope to a permanent disaster. That's one type. But also the jailer, the warden, who now, for a living, incarcerates his fellow human beings as a business, effectively, to survive, makes his living off of the incarceration of fellow human beings. That's no party either for that person who I think grew up in a country where you thought the opportunities would look and feel different from that. And as there are fewer and fewer jobs in this country, people cling ever more tightly to jobs that are in many ways based on a very dark calculus, and that is a very dark calculus indeed. And I met a lot of people who you can feel the regret lurking behind their job description.